The sound of gravel crunching beneath the tires was the first thing Arthur Bennett noticed as his car turned onto the long, curved driveway. The road had been empty for miles, lined with half-withered pines that looked older than time itself. And now, standing before him, was the house he hadn't visited in nearly 2 years, his second home. It sat quietly on the hill, just outside the city, a wide, pale structure that looked like it had secrets. The white paint had started to fade into a tired cream. The porch railing leaned slightly to one side, and the shutters, once a crisp ocean blue, had dulled with age. But still, it was beautiful in its own lonely way. This was the place Arthur had built during his middle years, back when ambition still burned in his chest. Back when he thought retirement would come easy. When he believed family would remain close and faithful. He parked near the steps, killed the engine, and sat there for a long moment. The house was supposed to be empty. That was the entire point of this visit, to prepare it for rent. It had been closed up since his wife's passing, and in his grief, he hadn't been able to return. Now, with the years catching up to him and finances tightening, renting it seemed practical. It would bring in some money, keep the place maintained, and maybe even breathe some life back into it. But as he looked at it now, a strange feeling tugged at the back of his mind. Something didn't feel right. The air was heavy, too still, too aware. The front curtain in the upstairs window moved slightly, as if a draft had slipped through. He dismissed it at first. Old houses had their ways of breathing, creaking, sighing, yet the movement didn't feel random. It felt deliberate, like someone had peeked out. Arthur stepped out of the car and stretched his back. The late afternoon sun painted the house in gold, but beneath that warmth, there was something colder and unease creeping into his bones. He picked up the keys from his pocket, the same old brass set that had hung on his kitchen wall for years. As he approached the porch, he noticed the faintest trace of footprints in the dust-fresh ones, too recent for comfort. He paused, bent down, and touched one with his fingertips. The edges were sharp, not days-old hours. His pulse tightened. The lock on the front door turned easily, too easily. The sound it made was smooth, unresisting. Arthur's brow furrowed. He distinctly remembered locking it himself the last time he left. He was methodical about such things: doors locked, windows latched, electricity cut. Yet now, as he pushed the door open, the faint hum of the refrigerator reached his ears. That hum should not have existed. He stepped inside, his shoes sinking into the thick carpet. The scent of the house hit him instantly, not the musty stillness he expected, but something livelier. A mix of floral perfume and faint cologne, the smell of people. The kind of scent that comes from living, breathing presence. The living room looked different. The furniture had been moved slightly. The sofa faced the window instead of the fireplace. A blanket was draped over the armrest. A coffee cup half full sat on the glass table. Arthur's chest constricted. He walked further in, slow, careful, scanning every corner. The house wasn't abandoned. It was being lived in. His mind scrambled for explanations. Perhaps the realtor had shown the property recently. Perhaps maintenance workers had come by. But then he remembered no one had the keys except him. He moved toward the kitchen. The counters were clean, dishes washed and drying on the rack. A bottle of wine sat on the counter, half empty. 2 glasses stood beside it. 2. He felt the chill of realization creeping down his neck. Arthur stepped into the hallway, his eyes falling on the staircase. The faintest sound came from above: a shuffle, a quick movement, followed by silence. His hand tightened around the railing. He could feel the pulse in his wrist hammering against his skin. He began to climb, one slow step at a time. Each wooden board creaked under his weight, echoing in the hollow air. At the top, the corridor stretched ahead, dimly lit by a single shaft of light coming through a cracked door at the far end: the master bedroom. His master bedroom. He could smell it now: perfume, stronger this time, almost sweetly nauseating. He reached the door and pushed it open. The sight inside froze him where he stood. The sheets were a tangled mess. A woman's purse lay on the chair, its contents spilling slightly. A pair of high heels rested carelessly beside the bed. On the nightstand sat a man's wristwatch, an elegant silver watch engraved with the words, "To Ethan, from Arthur. Welcome to the family." The world stopped moving. Arthur stared at the watch for what felt like an eternity, unable to breathe. His throat tightened. Ethan, his son-in-law. The husband of his daughter Anna, the man who had smiled across the dinner table, toasted to family, and called him Dad. The betrayal was so absurd, so unthinkable, that his mind resisted it. But the proof was there, in every scattered detail of the room. A soft sound came from behind him. He turned his head slightly, catching sight of movement through the reflection in the mirror. The blur of two figures, half hidden, scrambling quietly toward the adjoining bathroom. He didn't move. He didn't shout. He simply stood there, feeling his heart fracture into quiet pieces. The bathroom door closed. Silence followed. Arthur looked around again, absorbing every cruel detail, the fresh linens, the faint lipstick stain on the glass of water near the bed, the faint warmth still clinging to the room, as though the air itself hadn't realized what had just been exposed. For a long moment, he could hear only the steady rhythm of his own breathing. Slow, measured, angry. Then he turned and walked out, descending the stairs one deliberate step at a time. His mind was no longer fogged with confusion. It was crystal clear, almost frighteningly so. Outside, the wind had picked up, stirring the dry leaves on the porch. He stood there, gripping the railing, staring out across the overgrown yard. He could confront them, burst in, expose it all in a storm of anger. But what good would it do? The damage was already done. His daughter's husband had defiled not just his marriage, but Arthur's sanctuary, his second home, his refuge. That house had been built with love and trust, and now it was soaked in deceit. Arthur's mind shifted from shock to something colder: calculation. If Ethan was living here, it meant this wasn't a one-time betrayal. This was ongoing. Planned, which meant there was evidence, patterns, habits. And evidence could destroy a man far more effectively than a single confrontation ever could. Arthur looked at the house again, his expression hardening. This place would not be rented now, not yet. It would become something else, a stage, a trap, a silent witness. He would not tell Anna, not yet. He would not warn Ethan, not yet. He would let the truth build weight, until the day it would collapse over him like a storm. He turned toward his car, then paused, glancing back once more at the upstairs window. For a brief moment, the curtain moved again. He thought he saw a figure watching him, hidden in shadow. But he didn't linger. He got in his car, started the engine, and drove away. The image of that house shrinking in the rearview mirror like a secret refusing to stay buried. Behind him, the windows of the house reflected the dying light of sunset, warm, golden, and utterly deceptive. Inside, the ghosts of betrayal settled in, silent and smug. Arthur's hands gripped the steering wheel tighter. His heart wasn't just broken, it was determined. The next time he returned to that house, it wouldn't be as a landlord or a grieving widower, it would be as a man with a plan. Something had been stolen from him, not just property, not just peace, but the sanctity of family itself. And Arthur Bennett was not a man who let thieves walk away free. The second home was no longer just real estate. It had become the heart of a war. Arthur Bennett didn't sleep that night. The hours passed in long, deliberate silence, broken only by the ticking of the wall clock in his study. Each tick felt like a countdown to something inevitable. Not an explosion, but a slow surgical operation of justice. He sat by the window with a cup of black coffee growing cold in his hand, staring out at the darkness beyond. The house he'd visited earlier, his second home, stood 20 miles away, but it felt as though its walls were pressing in on him even now. Every detail replayed in his mind with painful clarity. The perfume, the shoes, the unmade bed, the silver watch. The betrayal wasn't abstract anymore. It was tangible, real. It had shape and scent and memory. He had built that house with love and precision. He remembered the day the foundation was poured, how he'd overseen every measurement himself. His late wife, Margaret, had chosen the curtains and furniture. She'd filled the place with warmth, insisting it should always feel like a sanctuary, and it had been. Until Ethan turned it into something filthy. Arthur placed the cold cup on the desk and leaned back in his chair. There was no rage in his expression, only a deep patient calm. He had spent his life managing crises in real estate, tenants who didn't pay, contractors who lied, partners who cheated. He'd learned long ago that emotion clouded judgment. The only way to win was to think, plan, and move with precision. By morning, his plan had already begun to form. The next day, he drove into town and stopped by a small electronics store. He spoke to no one except the clerk, asking only for the essentials: small motion-triggered cameras, discreet enough to blend into furniture, and a recording hub he could hide somewhere in the walls. The kind of setup a landlord might use to monitor a vacant property for security. He paid in cash. By afternoon, he was back at the house. The air was different this time. Heavier, as though the house itself was holding its breath. Arthur parked on the edge of the driveway instead of in front, choosing not to announce his presence. He unlocked the front door and entered quietly, his footsteps soft on the old carpet. It was empty. The scent of perfume still lingered faintly in the air, but the voices, the movement, the chaos of yesterday, all gone. The curtains were drawn, the lights off, the wine glasses rinsed and turned upside down near the sink. Whoever had been here was gone, but not for long, Arthur suspected. He moved methodically through the rooms, checking for signs of routine. There were groceries in the pantry, clothes in the guest room closet, a phone charger plugged in beside the bed. Not squatters' residents. Temporary ones, perhaps, but comfortable enough to make the place their own. Arthur set to work. He began with the living room, positioning a small camera behind a framed photograph on the mantel, a photo of him and Margaret on the day the house was built. The irony was not lost on him. Another camera went inside the air vent near the staircase, angled toward the hall. A third he placed behind the mirror in the master bedroom, where the light would catch just enough detail. Every movement was measured, every step deliberate. He didn't flinch when he entered the bedroom again. The sheets had been changed, the mess cleaned, but the memory of that scene was etched into his mind like a scar. He could almost hear their laughter, their whispers, their betrayal echoing in the quiet. Arthur left the room untouched, only pausing to glance at the nightstand. The watch was gone. Of course it was. He returned downstairs, checked the feed on the small recorder device, and ensured it was transmitting properly. Then he sat for a moment in the kitchen, staring at the house around him. Once this place had been a symbol of love, now it was bait. Days passed. Arthur didn't return immediately. He wanted them comfortable. He wanted them unaware. He went on with his life quietly, as though nothing had changed. He had dinner with Anna, listened as she talked about her work, and forced himself to smile when she mentioned Ethan's late nights. The lies tasted bitter, but he swallowed them anyway. Each time she said Ethan was working on a new business deal, Arthur's hand would tighten around his glass. But outwardly he was calm. Inside the storm gathered strength. A week later, he returned to the house, this time in the middle of the night. He parked far down the road and walked the last few hundred meters, his shoes crunching softly on the gravel. The house glowed faintly from within, a light on in the upstairs window. Arthur waited in the shadows, watching. Through the thin curtains, movement flickered. A silhouette, a man's frame, tall, familiar. Then another, a woman's, shorter, graceful, moving close to him. The sight sent a wave of cold fury through Arthur's veins. He stayed until the lights went out. Then he left without a sound. The next morning, he reviewed the footage. He sat at his desk, the small recording device connected to his laptop. One by one, the camera feeds came to life. The images were clear. The timestamps precise, and there they were. Ethan and the woman, laughing in the kitchen, drinking wine, moving through the house as if they owned it. Her hair was dark, unfamiliar. Not Anna's. Her face, young, smooth, carelessly happy, appeared clearly when she turned toward the light. Arthur studied her for a moment. She was no random stranger. She looked deliberate, maintained. Someone who knew what she wanted. Someone who had done this before. The footage continued, hands brushing, embraces, kisses stolen between laughter, and then, later, upstairs. The same room, the same bed. Arthur stopped the recording there. The house was no longer a mystery, it was a crime scene. He leaned back in his chair, staring at the blank wall in front of him. His reflection in the dark monitor stared back, calm but hollow-eyed. This wasn't just about Ethan anymore. It was about betrayal bleeding through generations, his wife gone, his daughter deceived, his family name stained in his own house. But he didn't rage. He didn't break. He planned. The following week, Arthur met with his old friend and lawyer, Richard Hayes. To the world, it was just two retired men sharing coffee at a local cafe. But between them, something heavier passed, a conversation built entirely on implications. Arthur didn't tell him everything, not yet. He asked about rental contracts, property rights, tenant evictions, privacy clauses, all under the guise of preparing his second home for tenants. Richard, sharp as ever, gave him the answers he needed. If someone lived in your property without consent, they were trespassing. If they left behind evidence, it was admissible. If they profited from it, say, through deceit, the consequences could multiply. Arthur thanked him, his mind already racing ahead. 2 weeks later, he returned to the house again, this time in daylight. Ethan's car was parked in the driveway. Arthur's heartbeat slowed instead of quickened. It was strange how calm he felt. Like a man returning to finish a job he already rehearsed. He parked beside the gate, stepped out, and approached the porch with quiet confidence. He could hear faint music from inside, soft, romantic, absurdly out of place. He unlocked the door with his own key and stepped inside. No one heard him. The music continued upstairs. The laughter came next. He stood in the living room for a long time, staring at the ceiling above him, listening. Then, quietly, he turned off the cameras one by one. He wasn't here for confrontation today. He was here to collect proof, the kind that would destroy a man completely. He went to the office, his office, where his old filing cabinet still stood. He opened the drawer, found the old property documents, and slid the recent footage's hard drive into the folder. A record of ownership, betrayal, and justice. Then he left as quietly as he came. The stage was set. Ethan didn't know it yet, but every step he took in that house, every touch, every lie, was now owned by Arthur. The house had turned from a refuge into a mirror, reflecting truth with surgical precision. And when the time came, Arthur would hand that truth to Anna, not in anger, but in clarity, because some wounds deserved to be seen. That night, Arthur stood by his window again, the city lights flickering below him. The plan had evolved. He would let Ethan sink deeper, build his web of deceit higher, until there was no escape. He knew exactly how this story would end, not with shouting, not with blood, but with reputation, legacy, and ruin, the kind that outlives a man. Arthur smiled faintly, though it didn't reach his eyes. The quiet trap had begun. The days turned colder. The sky carried that pale silver shade that seemed to dim even the brightest of mornings, and the air felt thick with quiet secrets. Arthur Bennett's life, on the surface, returned to routine. Polite conversations, morning coffee, an old man's daily walk, but beneath the calm exterior, something darker brewed. He had always believed that betrayal revealed itself in fragments, never in one moment. And now, his second home, the same home that once held laughter and love, was slowly revealing its truth piece by piece. The cameras he had placed had become silent witnesses to a deception that ran deeper than he had expected. Each evening, Arthur sat in his study, the screen glowing faintly against the dim light of the lamp beside him. His hands trembled slightly as he sorted through hours of recordings, each clip sharper than the one before. There was no longer a need for doubt. Ethan was not merely visiting the property, he had moved into it. The man who had once promised to protect Arthur's daughter was now living comfortably with his mistress inside the very walls Arthur built. The footage revealed patterns. Every Friday, Ethan arrived just before dusk, his black sedan pulling up quietly into the driveway. The woman, her name still unknown, arrived later, usually in a different car. She always brought something with her, groceries, wine, sometimes flowers. They would cook together, laugh, share the same couch, the same meals, the same bed. But it wasn't only passion that tied them there. They acted as though the place belonged to them, rearranging furniture, replacing Arthur's framed photographs with their own, hanging jackets on his coat rack, even redecorating parts of the living room with new cushions and a cheap rug. Each small change pierced Arthur deeper than the last. It wasn't simply infidelity, it was trespass, an erasure of everything sacred, his wife's memory, his own ownership, his daughter's dignity. Arthur began to take notes. He wrote with precision, marking each date and time, noting who arrived first, how long they stayed, what they touched, what they changed. He wasn't documenting emotions, he was building a case. He knew that anger burned fast and bright, but evidence endured. The following weekend, Arthur drove back to the property, this time early in the morning, when the fog still clung to the marshland and the world felt half awake. He parked far from the driveway, choosing instead to approach on foot through the side trail behind the oak trees. The house looked peaceful, but the air told a different story. The garbage bin by the porch was full, wine bottles, takeout boxes, and a few luxury brand bags torn and discarded. Inside the mailbox, Arthur found something that froze him. An envelope addressed to Ethan Rivers. Sent by a local real estate agent. Ethan had changed the mailing address. Arthur's jaw tightened. This wasn't temporary. Ethan wasn't hiding in shame or guilt. He was establishing residence, claiming space. The arrogance of it was staggering. He slipped the letter into his coat pocket and entered the house. Inside, the smell of perfume was stronger than ever. The faint hum of the heater filled the air, suggesting the electricity bill was being paid by someone who thought he owned the right to it. Arthur walked through the house silently, noting every violation. A jacket on the banister. 2 toothbrushes in the bathroom. His daughter's framed picture, which once sat proudly on the living room shelf, was gone. In its place stood a cheap photo of Ethan and the woman, smiling, her arms wrapped around him. Arthur's hand hovered over the frame, then pulled back. He didn't smash it. He didn't even touch it. He simply turned away, because destruction was too easy, exposure would be cleaner. Back at home that evening, he prepared for the next phase. He called a private investigator, a quiet one. The kind who didn't ask questions about motives, only results. He wanted the woman's name, her background, her connection to Ethan. He wanted to know everything, her job, her habits, her weaknesses. Within days, the report came back. Her name was Melissa Carter, 28 years old, single, a real estate agent from the nearby city. She had no family in town, no significant assets, and a history of relationships with married clients. Ethan wasn't her first. She had built a pattern, finding men with property, men who could offer comfort, status, or both. Arthur studied the report quietly. The puzzle pieces were aligning. Ethan's recent business ventures, the ones he told Anna about, had been funded with loans. Arthur had co-signed one of them a year earlier, helping his son-in-law open a renovation firm. That firm was now struggling. Ethan was living beyond his means, and Melissa's presence suddenly made sense. Together, they weren't just indulging in betrayal. They were scheming for survival. Perhaps Ethan planned to sell the second house, or at least use it as collateral. Perhaps he was already claiming ownership informally, planning to blur the boundaries of property and family. Arthur leaned back in his chair, the realization cold and bitter. This wasn't just infidelity. It was theft, disguised in love, wrapped in deceit. The next day, Arthur visited his lawyer again. This time the conversation was more pointed. He brought copies of his property deed, utility bills, and the newly discovered letter addressed to Ethan. He didn't mention family. He didn't mention betrayal. He presented everything as a landlord dealing with an unauthorized occupant. Calm, factual, deliberate. Richard, his lawyer, nodded gravely. If someone has been living there without permission, he said, we'll need evidence. Photos, surveillance, proof of entry. Arthur had all three. He left the office with a quiet sense of satisfaction. The legal groundwork was ready. Now all he needed was timing and patience. Weeks passed. The cameras continued to record, capturing new layers of hypocrisy. Sometimes Melissa arrived first, sometimes Ethan. They hosted dinners, friends even, laughter-filling rooms once silent. There were gifts exchanged, toasts raised, evenings spent by the fire. Arthur didn't stop watching. He didn't stop recording. Each new clip was a brick in the wall of their own destruction. But amid the coldness of his mission, a weight began to build in him, the weight of what this revelation would do to Anna. She still called often, still spoke of Ethan with love and pride. She told Arthur that Ethan had been investing in new projects, that he was spending long hours at a client's property. Arthur listened to every word, his silence the heaviest truth in the room. He had promised himself not to act impulsively, but the burden of secrecy was beginning to erode him. Still, he waited. He had learned that justice demanded precision, not haste. Late one evening, while reviewing new footage, Arthur saw something unexpected. Ethan was on a phone call, pacing the kitchen. He sounded angry, though the cameras captured only the faint rhythm of his voice. He gestured wildly, slamming his hand on the counter. Melissa appeared moments later, trying to calm him, but he shoved her hand away and stormed out of the room. Arthur zoomed in on the table where Ethan had left his open laptop. On the screen, frozen for a moment, was an email draft addressed to a bank representative. The subject line read, Equity Inquiry, Lakeview Property. Arthur's blood ran cold. Lakeview Property, that was the legal name of his second home. Ethan wasn't just living there. He was trying to borrow money against it. Arthur sat back slowly, realization sinking in. This was no longer a matter of personal betrayal. This was criminal. Fraud, property misrepresentation, attempted forgery, the kind of act that could destroy a man's reputation permanently. He stared at the paused frame of Ethan's laptop screen for a long time. Every deceitful act until now had been personal. But this was actionable. He knew then that the time for patience was almost over. The next day, he visited the property once more, not as a father or a victim, but as a man reclaiming what was his. He arrived just after dawn, when the mist still clung to the grass and the light barely touched the porch. He entered quietly, walked through the house, and began taking photographs. Every room, every personal belonging, every sign of Ethan and Melissa's life there. The wine glasses, the clothes in the closet, the mail addressed to Ethan, even Melissa's perfume bottles in the bathroom, all catalogued with precision. When he finished, he went to the master bedroom, where the curtains swayed faintly in the morning breeze. He stood by the window for a long moment, staring out across the empty fields. This was where it began, and where it would end. Arthur took one last photograph of the bed, perfectly made, deceptively peaceful, and then turned away. He locked the door behind him, slid the key into his pocket, and walked back to his car. The evidence was complete. Now all that remained was the reveal. That night, as he organized the files and documents, he felt an unfamiliar calm settle over him. Not peace, but closure. He thought of Anna. He thought of the moment she would see the truth, the way her world would shift, the pain it would cause. But he also thought of the necessity, because sometimes love meant breaking illusions before they broke you. Arthur looked at the folder on his desk labeled Lakeview, Occupancy Records. It was clean, complete, irrefutable. Ethan had no idea that the very walls he had defiled had been his own undoing. And as Arthur turned off the light and closed his eyes, he knew the next step would end everything. The trap was set. The evidence was ready. And the storm was about to begin. The winter sun broke through the blinds in faint stripes of light across Arthur Bennett's study. The world outside moved quietly. The hum of traffic, the distant bark of a dog, the sound of life continuing as if nothing had changed. But inside that small, tidy room, something irreversible was unfolding. The evidence lay spread across the desk: photographs, time-stamped recordings, property documents, and printed emails. Together they formed a mosaic of betrayal, mapped out with surgical precision. Ethan Rivers was no longer just a disloyal husband. He was a man on the brink of exposure, a fraud wrapped in charm and entitlement. Arthur sat perfectly still, his gaze heavy, his hand tracing the edge of a photograph of his daughter. The picture had been taken years ago, Anna smiling, eyes bright, her head resting on Ethan's shoulder. That image had once filled him with pride. Now it felt like a cruel joke. The world she lived in was about to collapse, and he was the one holding the match. For weeks, Arthur had gathered evidence quietly, methodically. Now he was ready to release it. But justice, he knew, wasn't a moment, it was a process. And he was about to start one that would unravel lives. The first step was legal. Arthur's lawyer, Richard Hayes, was a man who had spent decades navigating the gray lines of property law. When Arthur walked into his office with a thick folder under his arm, Richard's instincts sharpened. The folder was labeled Lakeview, occupancy violation. Its contents would speak louder than any accusation ever could. Arthur explained the essentials: unauthorized occupancy, potential misuse of property title, possible fraudulent representation to financial institutions. He spoke in terms of contracts and clauses, never mentioning the personal nature behind the evidence. To Richard, this was a landlord enforcing his rights. To Arthur, it was war, a quiet, calculated war dressed in legality. By the end of that meeting, the first wave had begun. A formal notice of trespass and eviction was filed against any occupant residing in the Lakeview property without permission. A copy was prepared for hand delivery, another was mailed, and a third, sealed and notarized, was submitted to the local property registry office. Arthur made sure Ethan's name appeared nowhere on the original documents. That omission was intentional. Let Ethan find out the hard way that the law did not recognize him, that he was, in every sense, a ghost living in another man's house. The next morning, the process server delivered the notice. It was a cold Friday, the air sharp with a bite of early frost. The house stood quietly against the dull sky, its porch empty, the windows reflecting gray light. When the knock came, it wasn't Arthur who stood there. It was the system, unfeeling, methodical, carrying authority on official paper. The woman Melissa was the one who opened the door. The notice was placed in her hands, a single page that would change everything. Vacate premises within 10 days. Unauthorized occupation of private property constitutes civil and criminal liability. Failure to comply may result in immediate legal intervention. Inside that house, once built on love and family, panic began to take shape. Arthur wasn't there to see it. He didn't need to. He could imagine it perfectly. Ethan's shock, his denial, his attempt to rationalize the letter, the way he'd paced the room searching for an explanation. He could picture Melissa reading the notice again and again, her face paling as reality set in. The trap had sprung, silently, efficiently. Arthur spent that evening in silence, reading by the window while the city lights flickered outside. He didn't need revenge in noise or spectacle. He wanted consequence, the kind that moves slowly, like rising water around someone's ankles until they realized too late that they were drowning. The next step unfolded naturally. 3 days later, the local utility company received a directive ownership verification of Lakeview property. Arthur's signature, attached to the deed, reactivated the account under his own name. Power and water bills would now redirect to his address. The quiet control of the property returned, piece by piece. Ethan's illusion of stability began to crack. By the fifth day, the first cracks became fractures. The bank, having received an inquiry regarding the property's equity claim, contacted Arthur directly as the legal owner. The message was brief, routine, but confirming Ethan had attempted to use the house as collateral. The attempt had triggered a red flag in their system, given the mismatch in ownership details. Arthur responded calmly, attaching scanned proof of title and a polite clarification that no authorization had ever been granted. Within hours, the fraudulent application was flagged for review. The machine of law had started to move, and once it moved, it didn't stop. Back at the Lakeview property, the atmosphere had changed. Melissa stopped visiting as often. The laughter had gone. The curtains remained closed even in daylight. Ethan's car appeared sporadically, sometimes for hours, sometimes just long enough for him to retrieve something before driving off again. The walls that had once held their stolen comfort now held tension instead. Arthur didn't need to be there. The camera still watched, quietly capturing every shift. Ethan's confidence was gone. His movements were restless, agitated. He made phone calls, many of them. Sometimes he shouted, sometimes he sat in silence, staring at the walls as though they might explain how his perfect little secret had begun to crumble. Arthur observed, detached. Each new recording was a study in downfall. He had expected anger when the eviction notice arrived, perhaps even confrontation, but Ethan had chosen avoidance instead. That, Arthur realized, was worse. Because it meant Ethan was scared, and fear, once it took hold, made people reckless. A week later, Arthur received the official confirmation he had been waiting for. The property court approved the eviction order. Enforcement officers would visit the premises within 72 hours to ensure compliance. He read the document twice, folded it neatly, and set it aside. The storm he had started was now beyond his control, and that was exactly how he wanted it. He didn't visit the house that week. He let the process unfold naturally, each step recorded, time-stamped, documented. The law moved slowly, but it moved with weight, and now it was bearing down on Ethan Rivers. When the eviction team arrived that following Monday, the scene was quiet. Arthur didn't attend. He didn't need to see what was inevitable. But one of the officers later described it in formal detail. The occupants appeared shocked and unprepared, their belongings hastily packed, their expressions a mixture of confusion and disbelief. Melissa had been the one to speak most, demanding explanations, insisting there had been a misunderstanding. Ethan, meanwhile, had stood silently, watching as the officers walked through rooms he had once called his escape. They left before noon. The house, once violated, was returned to silence. That evening, Arthur drove to the property for the first time since everything began. The driveway was empty. The porch light flickered dimly. The air smelled of dust and cold wood. He stepped inside and stood in the foyer, his eyes scanning the familiar walls. Everything was still, no laughter. No perfume, no betrayal hiding behind doors, just quiet. He walked slowly through each room, inspecting what remained. The bed unmade, the drawers half empty, a single glass left by the sink, evidence of a hasty departure. In the living room, one of the picture frames lay shattered on the floor. Ethan's photograph, broken across the middle, smiled faintly beneath the cracked glass. Arthur stared at it for a moment, then crouched, picked up the pieces carefully, and placed them in the trash bin. It was over. The house was his again. But victory, Arthur realized, carried its own kind of emptiness. He looked around, at the furniture, the walls, the memories, and understood that while he had reclaimed his property, something deeper had been permanently lost. Trust, innocence, family. Later that night, he sat at the kitchen table, the house dimly lit by the glow of the small pendant lamp above him. His phone rested beside the eviction paperwork. He knew what came next, telling Anna. He had delayed it as long as possible. He had justified it with logic, that she needed the truth presented properly, that she deserved facts, not chaos. But beneath the logic was something more human, the fear of watching her heart break. He reached for the folder labeled Evidence, Private, containing everything, photographs, recordings, and a lawyer's documentation. He placed it carefully inside a larger envelope. Tomorrow, he would deliver it to her himself. Not as a father seeking revenge, but as one offering clarity. Because sometimes the hardest form of love wasn't protection. It was truth. Outside, the night deepened. The world went still. The Lakeview property, once desecrated, now reclaimed, stood silent under the cold light of the moon. The legal storm had passed, but its aftermath was only beginning. Arthur had won the battle for his home. But the battle for his daughter's heart, that he knew would test him far more. He looked toward the empty hallway, then to the window where the faint reflection of his tired face stared back at him. Justice had been done. Yet peace somehow still felt far away. The morning began like any other, calm, pale, ordinary. The kind of morning that carries no warning of what it will bring. But for Arthur Bennett, it wasn't ordinary at all. It was the morning he would end a lie. The folder sat on the passenger seat beside him as he drove, thick, sealed, and heavy in more ways than one. The label read simply for Anna. Inside, it contained the complete record of betrayal, photographs, time-stamped footage, legal filings, and the eviction order that bore his signature. Each piece of paper was a blade, sharp, honest, unavoidable. The road stretched ahead, long and quiet. His daughter's house sat at the edge of town, a tidy 2-story home with rose bush along the front gate. He had helped them move in years ago. He could still remember Ethan painting the fence, Anna laughing beside him. Back then, the world had felt simple: family dinners, shared holidays, the comforting illusion that good people stayed loyal. Now, as Arthur's car slowed near the driveway, that memory twisted inside him like something spoiled. He parked but didn't step out immediately. The stillness of the morning seemed to mock him. For a moment, he considered turning back. After all, once truth left his hands, it couldn't be taken back. It would break her world. Not gently, not gradually, but completely. He rested both hands on the steering wheel and closed his eyes. The weight of fatherhood pressed down on him, the need to protect, the guilt of knowing he couldn't. Then, with a slow, steady breath, he opened the car door and stepped out. The front porch was quiet. The faint scent of freshly brewed coffee drifted from inside. Anna was home. Arthur placed the envelope on the doorstep. His handwriting on the front was simple: "Please read alone." He stood there for a long moment, staring at it. He could have knocked. He could have faced her, told her everything in person. But he knew himself. Wouldn't he have the strength to watch her face change when she learned the truth? So he left the truth at her door like an unwanted gift. Then he turned and walked away. Hours passed before his phone rang. He didn't answer. He couldn't. Instead, he sat in his living room, the curtains drawn, the television silent, staring at nothing. The world outside moved as usual, cars passing, neighbors talking, but inside time stood still. He knew what she was seeing: the photos, the videos, the letter from the lawyer, the bank documents, the eviction order. He imagined her disbelief turning to confusion, confusion to shock, shock to grief. He could see her sitting on the floor, clutching the papers, struggling to breathe. He had lived long enough to know how betrayal sounded when it first broke. It was never loud. It was silent. It was the sound of someone realizing the person they loved never really existed. The phone rang again. He let it ring. And then the silence returned. By evening, there was a knock at his door. He didn't move right away. For a moment, he sat frozen, knowing who it was before even looking. Then he rose, slow and heavy, and opened the door. Anna stood there. Her face was pale, her eyes swollen, but there were no tears, just emptiness. The kind of emptiness that came after the storm had already passed through. In her hand, she held the envelope, now crumpled at the edges. Arthur stepped aside silently. She entered without a word. He didn't speak, she didn't either. The air between them was thick, not with anger, but with shared pain. Anna moved to the living room and sat down, placing the envelope on the table. Arthur stood across from her, his hands trembling slightly. There were no accusations, no outburst, only stillness. Arthur wanted to explain, to soften the edges of what she had seen, but there was no soft way to tell someone that their entire life had been built on deception. So he stood in silence as she stared at the floor, her breathing shallow, her fingers tracing the edge of the paper as if hoping the truth might change if she touched it enough times. The clock on the wall ticked quietly. Seconds stretched like hours. When she finally lifted her head, her eyes met his, tired, broken, but steady. In that look, Arthur saw everything, her heartbreak, her understanding, her unspoken gratitude and grief intertwined. He didn't need words. Some truths don't need to be spoken aloud. They exist in the silence between two people who finally see the same reality. That night, Anna didn't go home. She stayed in her old room, the one that still carried faint traces of her childhood, the books on the shelf, the photograph of her mother on the nightstand. Arthur sat outside her door for a long time after she went to bed, listening to the quiet sound of her crying through the wall. It was a slow, muffled sound, the sound of someone trying not to fall apart. He wanted to go in to comfort her, but he didn't. Some pain he knew had to be faced alone. The next morning, Arthur found her sitting on the porch with a cup of coffee, her face pale in the dawn light. She had packed a small bag, clothes, a few essentials, nothing more. The car keys lay beside her. She didn't say where she was going, but he knew. Ethan's world was about to end. Arthur didn't stop her. He simply stood by the window as she drove away, her taillights disappearing down the long road. A strange mixture of sorrow and relief washed over him. He had set events in motion that could never be undone. The truth had finally reached where it needed to, but at a cost neither of them could measure. Later that afternoon, Arthur received a call from his lawyer. Ethan had appeared at the registry office, demanding an explanation for the eviction. His tone, they said, had been erratic, angry, desperate, confused. The bank had already begun reviewing his fraudulent application. His firm was under investigation for misrepresentation. And now, his wife, the one person whose belief had kept him afloat, knew everything. Arthur listened without emotion. It wasn't triumph he felt, it was exhaustion. Years of dignity and patience had led to this hollow victory. He had protected his daughter's future, reclaimed his property, and exposed a fraud. But in the process, something essential had been drained from him, the illusion that justice brings peace. Because peace, Arthur realized, never truly comes after betrayal, only quiet. That evening Anna returned. Her face was calmer now, her posture stronger, but her voice, though he didn't hear it, carried the weight of finality. She had ended it. Arthur didn't ask how, he didn't need to know the details. He could see it in her eyes, a mixture of heartbreak and resolve, the look of someone who had closed a chapter forever. She stayed silent as she unpacked her things in the guest room. The house felt heavier than ever, filled with the kind of stillness that comes after long storms. Arthur sat on the porch as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in soft shades of gold and gray. He watched the last light fade, thinking about everything that had unfolded. The house he once lost was his again. His daughter was free, though broken. The man who betrayed them both was left adrift, his lies turned into chains. And yet, in the quiet of that evening, Arthur didn't feel victorious. He felt old, because revenge, when done right, doesn't end in satisfaction. It ends in silence. As the night deepened, he walked through the empty rooms of his home, turning off lights one by one. His reflection followed him in the dark glass of the windows, older now, wearier, but unshaken. He paused by the last window, looking out at the dark street beyond. Somewhere out there, Ethan was realizing that his carefully built world had crumbled. The woman he loved was gone. The property he tried to claim was taken. The law, slow but merciless, was closing in. Arthur exhaled slowly, the faintest breath of closure escaping his lips. Justice had been served, not loudly, not cruelly, but cleanly. And as the wind rustled the trees outside, the old house seemed to settle, not in pain, not in victory, but in peace. The kind of peace that comes only after truth has burned everything false to ash. The fall of a man rarely comes all at once. It begins quietly with missed calls, unopened letters, and the small tremors that shake the foundations long before the walls collapse. For Ethan Rivers, the tremors had begun weeks ago. He just hadn't felt them until now. When the eviction notice first arrived, he had treated it like a misunderstanding, something temporary, something fixable. But by the time his wife walked out of their home, leaving behind silence and a folded letter, denial was no longer possible. Everything he built, the business, the marriage, the image, had begun to crack. And now, the cracks had widened into ruin. The once polished office of Rivers Renovations had grown cold and hollow. The walls, once lined with framed certificates and glossy photos of completed projects, now looked stripped and tired. The phones had stopped ringing days ago. The accounts had been frozen. Clients were withdrawing contracts faster than he could respond. Word had spread, quietly at first, then like wildfire. The whispers about forged ownership documents, about unauthorized collateral, about investigations. No one wanted to be tied to a man under review by both the bank and the court. The investors who once shook his hand now ignored his calls. The men who once called him visionary now avoided eye contact. And Ethan, who had once walked into rooms with the confidence of a man who owned his world, now moved like someone who had misplaced it entirely. At home, silence became his companion. The house that once echoed with his wife's laughter now felt larger, emptier. The faint scent of her perfume had vanished, replaced by the sterile odor of abandonment. Every corner reminded him of what he had destroyed, not through impulse, but arrogance. He had believed he could have both. The loyalty of a good woman and the thrill of forbidden pleasure. The comfort of wealth and the audacity of deceit. But now there was nothing left of either. The mistress, Melissa, had disappeared the moment the eviction papers arrived. Her calls stopped. Her number disconnected. She had always been good at disappearing when things got complicated. He had thought she loved him, or at least, that she needed him. But he was learning now that she only stayed as long as he could provide a house that wasn't his, wine that wasn't paid for, and comfort that wasn't earned. When the house fell, so did her affection. He spent his days pacing, his nights staring at walls. Sleep became a stranger. Each time he closed his eyes, images came back, the knock on the door, the letter, the officers walking through the Lakeview house. He saw Arthur Bennett's signature on every page of that eviction order. The same steady handwriting he had once seen on a wedding card, on a Christmas gift, on the note that said, "Welcome to the family." He thought about that house, the Lakeview property, with its quiet marsh view and the wraparound porch. The place that had felt like escape. The place where he had believed no one could see him. And yet, somehow Arthur had seen everything. The humiliation wasn't loud. It was quiet, suffocating, precise. The legal summons came next. It arrived one gray morning, the kind of morning where the air felt heavy and motionless. The document bore the seal of the local civil court, a formal notification of property fraud investigation. Arthur's name appeared as the claimant, Ethan's as the respondent. He read it 3 times, each word cutting deeper. The charges were not exaggerated. They were factual, cold. Unauthorized occupancy, attempted equity misrepresentation, breach of fiduciary trust. The same law that he had once twisted to his advantage was now the very weapon being used against him. He sat at the kitchen table for hours, the paper limp in his hands, the clock ticking behind him. It wasn't anger that filled him. It was dread. Because in that moment, he understood the nature of Arthur's revenge. It wasn't rage. It was order. Arthur hadn't come shouting. He hadn't confronted him in person. He had let the world, the system, the law, the evidence, do the talking. It was the kind of revenge that didn't destroy a man instantly. It erased him slowly, methodically, piece by piece. Days bled into nights. He sold his car to cover the first round of legal expenses. He borrowed money from a friend, then another, but the more he tried to explain, the less people believed him. Every favor he asked for seemed to cost him another ounce of dignity. The court hearings began. Arthur never spoke directly to him. He didn't need to. The evidence spoke for itself. Photographs, documents, surveillance footage, every detail laid bare. Every secret captured in the quiet lens of a hidden camera. The judge's questions came like hammer blows. Ethan's voice trembled as he tried to justify the residency confusion, but each answer dug the hole deeper. He realized too late that there was no confusion, only deceit, and the law had no patience for deceit written in ink and time-stamped on record. By the third session, the verdict was clear. He was ordered to pay damages and restitution, a sum he couldn't afford. He was banned from operating as a licensed contractor for 5 years. And his name, once printed proudly on brochures and websites, now appeared in public records under the heading Civil Breach of Trust. Arthur attended the final hearing but left before the verdict was read. He didn't need to hear it. Justice didn't need witnesses. Ethan saw him once, across the courtroom. Sitting quietly in the second row, eyes steady, face expressionless. That moment stayed with him. Because it was then he understood that Arthur hadn't destroyed him out of hatred. He had done it out of principle. The kind of man who built homes for others could not forgive someone who desecrated his own. By summer, Ethan's life had shrunk to a single room in a low-rent apartment on the edge of the city. The paint on the walls peeled, the water dripped from a leaky tap, and the nights stretched long and empty. He worked small labor jobs, hauling materials, painting houses, tasks that once he paid others to do. Sometimes he passed construction sites where his company's old logo still lingered faintly on discarded signs. He would stop and stare, remembering what it felt like to be someone people respected. But respect, he now knew, wasn't taken. It was borrowed, and he had spent it recklessly. Arthur Bennett's name was never far from his thoughts. Not in anger, not anymore, but in a strange, haunting respect. Because while Ethan had built his career on charm and shortcuts, Arthur had dismantled it with patience and integrity. In the stillness of his small apartment, Ethan began to understand something profound, that revenge had not merely punished him. It had revealed him to himself. He saw his own greed, his arrogance, his need for admiration that led him to betray the very people who had given him everything. And that realization, more than the court orders or the financial ruin, was what truly broke him. Months passed. The seasons changed. The city forgot his name. Arthur, meanwhile, lived quietly. He didn't boast. He didn't mention Ethan's downfall to anyone. The world didn't need to know. He wasn't after spectacle, only restoration. The Lakeview property stood once more in quiet dignity. The walls repainted, the porch repaired, the windows opened to sunlight again. It was empty, but not lifeless. It had reclaimed its silence. Sometimes Arthur visited it alone. He would walk through the rooms, his steps slow, deliberate, remembering what they had once meant. He didn't hate Ethan anymore. He didn't need to. Hate was noise, and he preferred quiet. He knew somewhere, perhaps across the city, the man who had once betrayed him was still alive, smaller now, humbler, stripped of everything but breath. And that was enough. One late afternoon, as Arthur stood on the porch watching the sunset over the marsh, he realized something he hadn't before, that the house had witnessed not just betrayal, but transformation. It had seen deceit, exposure, punishment, and now peace. It no longer carried the scent of other sins. It was his again, clean, calm, and timeless. Justice, Arthur thought, wasn't about triumph. It was about balance. He turned, locking the door behind him, the key cold and heavy in his palm. The sound of the lock clicking shut echoed softly in the still air, final, absolute. The man who had once been wronged had reclaimed not only his property, but his dignity. And the man who had once betrayed them, all now lived among the ghosts of his own choices, learning, perhaps too late, that what's borrowed will always be returned, one way or another. The storm had passed. Not suddenly, but in the quiet way storms always do, leaving behind silence, debris, and a heavy scent of rain-soaked earth. Months had gone by since the court's final ruling. The papers were signed, the debts collected, the silence restored. Ethan Rivers had vanished from the city's conversations, leaving behind little more than whispers and forgotten invoices. And in that silence, Arthur Bennett began a slow process of rebuilding. The Lakeview property, once desecrated, then reclaimed, now stood as both wound and remedy. Its walls had seen deceit, its floors had carried betrayal, but the structure remained, and that, Arthur thought, was something worth saving. The first time he returned to begin repairs, the air was heavy with dust. He walked through the rooms with measured steps, his fingers tracing the edges of door frames, the grooves in the banister, the cracks in the walls. The damage wasn't structural, it was personal. The kind that didn't show up in blueprints but lingered in the air like memory. The living room, once cluttered with the evidence of another man's life, was now empty. The faint outlines of furniture still marked the floor, ghostly reminders of what had been there. Arthur stood in the middle of the room for a long while, the soft afternoon light falling through the windows, catching particles of dust that danced in slow golden swirls. He didn't feel anger anymore. Just resolve. If deceit had lived here, then renewal would too. He began with the smallest things. He replaced the locks, not out of fear, but finality. He repainted the walls, every stroke deliberate, as if each layer of fresh color could cover another layer of pain. He repaired the old banister himself, sanding the wood until it felt smooth again under his touch. There was something deeply meditative in the process. The rhythm of work, the smell of paint and sawdust, the satisfaction of order returning where chaos once reigned. Each repair was a statement. I am still here. This house is still mine. He spent days at the property now, driving in each morning and leaving at dusk. Sometimes Anna joined him, not to work, but simply to sit on the porch, watching him labor with quiet focus. She didn't speak much. Neither did he. But between them, silence no longer felt like a wound. It felt like understanding. She had moved on in her own way. The divorce papers were finalized, and she had begun teaching again, reclaiming the life she'd put aside for a marriage that had never deserved her. Her laughter was different now, quieter, more measured, but it was real. And for Arthur, that was enough. He saw in her a reflection of the house itself, broken once but not beyond repair. Spring came early that year. The marsh beyond the property began to bloom again, reeds rising, birds returning, water glittering beneath the morning sun. For the first time in years, the place felt alive. Arthur decided to restore the garden next. It had once been his wife Margaret's pride, rows of lilac roses and lavender surrounding the porch, but neglect had turned it wild. The soil was dry, the plants overrun. He spent hours clearing weeds, turning the earth, and planting new seeds. As he worked, he thought about her, the way she used to hum softly while tending to the flowers, the way she had insisted the garden be planted facing the sunrise. Sometimes, grief returned, not sharp, but soft, like the echo of an old song. It came to him in the scent of lilacs, in the creak of the porch swing, in the memory of her laughter carried by the wind. But grief, Arthur had learned, could live alongside peace. It didn't have to consume. It could simply be. By summer, the transformation was complete. The walls gleamed with fresh paint. The floors shone with polish. The room smelled of cedar and sunlight instead of dust and perfume. The house looked alive again, not new, but honest. Arthur stood at the front gate one evening, looking at what he had rebuilt. The golden light of dusk stretched across the porch, bathing everything in warmth. The house looked almost the same as it had years ago, before everything fell apart. But there was something deeper in it now, the strength of having endured. It wasn't just a property anymore. It was testimony. Arthur decided not to rent it out after all. The idea of strangers living here, touching the walls, walking the floors that held so many memories felt wrong. Instead, he turned it into a retreat, a place for reflection. A place where Anna could visit when she needed silence. He kept the furniture minimal, a few bookshelves, a desk, a chair by the window overlooking the marsh. The house didn't need decoration anymore. It needed space for air, for memory, for healing. Sometimes, he spent weekends there alone. He would rise before dawn, brew coffee, and sit by the window watching the mist lift from the water. The stillness was no longer suffocating. It was sacred. One afternoon, while sorting through old boxes in the attic, Arthur found something unexpected, a letter from Margaret, written years before her passing. The envelope was yellowed with age, the handwriting elegant and steady. He opened it slowly, his breath catching as he read her words. She had written about the house, about how she hoped it would always remain in the family, not just as a property, but as a refuge. She wrote about love, about resilience, about the importance of holding on to places that remind us who we are. Arthur folded the letter carefully, his eyes misted but calm. It felt like a message sent across time, a reminder that some things, even when broken, can be rebuilt stronger. He placed the letter in a frame and hung it in the hallway. It became the house's new center, a quiet declaration of purpose. As months passed, visitors began to notice. Neighbors who had once whispered about the scandal now admired the transformation. The house that had once been a symbol of disgrace was now a beacon of renewal. Arthur never corrected anyone's assumptions about what had happened there. He didn't need to. The truth didn't belong to gossip. It belonged to him. Sometimes he would catch sight of Anna sitting on the porch, reading quietly, the sunlight catching her hair. And in those moments, he realized that the house had done what it was meant to do all along: shelter, heal, endure. One evening, as the sun sank below the horizon, Arthur sat by the window of the living room, the same spot where it had all begun months ago. The world outside was calm, the air warm, the sky painted in shades of orange and rose. He thought of everything that had passed, the betrayal, the confrontation, the collapse, the rebuilding, and for the first time in years, he felt light. The Lakeview house had been violated, but it had not been defeated. And neither had he. When night fell, he locked the door, walked out to the porch, and stood beneath the stars. The marsh shimmered faintly in the distance, the sound of crickets filling the stillness. He thought of Ethan, not with anger, but with distance. Somewhere the man was still alive, still facing the consequences of his own making. But that story no longer belonged to Arthur. His chapter was closed. The house behind him stood tall, steady, unshaken. And in that quiet night, Arthur understood the lesson the house had been teaching him all along. That ownership wasn't about possession. It was about preservation. What we build, if built with integrity, can survive anything, even betrayal. The seasons had turned once again. The marshland glistened under early autumn light, the wreaths swaying gently in the cool wind. The Lakeview property had grown into something sacred, no longer a house of betrayal, but a monument of endurance. Arthur Bennett had settled into a quiet rhythm. Each day began with coffee on the porch, the newspaper folded beside him, the silence of the landscape stretching endlessly ahead. There was peace here now, not the fragile peace of avoidance, but the deep-earned calm of acceptance. But peace, Arthur knew, is never permanent. It is only borrowed, and sometimes the past comes to collect what is owed. It began on a Tuesday. Arthur had been trimming the hedge near the driveway when he heard it, the faint crunch of tires on gravel. It was an unfamiliar sound now. Visitors were rare, and Anna always called before coming. He straightened, resting his hand on the handle of the shears, his gaze shifting toward the bend in the road. A car approached, dark, small, quiet. It came to a hesitant stop near the gate. The engine idled for a moment, then turned off. When the door opened, a figure stepped out. Arthur's breath caught. It was Melissa Carter, the woman who had once shared Ethan's deception. For a moment, he thought he was imagining her, that perhaps memory had conjured her shape out of the air. But then she looked up, and the faint autumn light caught her face. Time had changed her. The gloss of arrogance was gone. Her hair, once perfectly styled, now hung loosely around her shoulders. The confidence that once defined her movements had faded, replaced by uncertainty. She stood by the gate, hands clasped in front of her, her posture small, almost apologetic. Arthur didn't move. He simply watched, silent and unreadable. After a long moment, she opened the gate and stepped in. Her shoes crunched against the gravel path. The air between them was heavy, not with anger, but with history. Arthur said nothing. His face was calm, though his chest carried the faint ache of unwelcome memory. Melissa paused near the porch steps, her eyes sweeping over the house, the fresh paint, the restored porch, the blooming garden. Everything she had once desecrated now stood renewed. The sight seemed to wound her. She lowered her head slightly as if acknowledging it. Arthur could sense that she wasn't here for confrontation. There was no fire in her eyes, no defense in her stance. She had come for something else, something quieter. She lingered at the edge of the porch, uncertain. Arthur finally spoke, his voice steady low. He asked nothing. He offered nothing. Only the sound of the wind filled the silence between them. Melissa took a slow breath, her shoulders trembling slightly. She began to speak, not in words Arthur could hear, but in the way her body folded under the weight of guilt. Her expression carried the apology her voice could not form. Arthur studied her face, pale, tired, stripped of vanity. The woman before him was not the same one from the videos. That woman had been careless, bold, alive with defiance. This one looked like she hadn't slept in months. For a moment, Arthur almost pitied her, almost. She reached into her bag and pulled out a small envelope. The paper was wrinkled, the seal already broken. She held it out to him with trembling fingers. Arthur hesitated, then took it. Inside was a letter handwritten, familiar in tone but not her own. It was from Ethan. The handwriting was uneven, hurried. The letter was short, a few lines at most. A plea, perhaps. A confession, a final attempt to explain. Arthur read it slowly, his expression unchanged. Ethan's words were filled with regret, the kind that comes not from self-awareness, but from loss. He wrote about mistakes, about weakness, about the life that had fallen apart around him. He mentioned Melissa, that she had left when the walls closed in, that he didn't blame her. He mentioned Anna, his guilt, his shame, his acceptance that forgiveness would never come. And then near the end, he wrote of the house, the Lakeview property, calling it, the place that ruined me and saved me all at once. Arthur's eyes lingered on that line for a long time. He folded the letter carefully and placed it back inside the envelope. Melissa stood silently, her gaze fixed on the porch floor. She didn't ask for forgiveness. She didn't cry. She seemed to understand that some wounds didn't heal through words. Arthur turned slightly, looking out at the horizon. The sun was lowering, streaking the marsh in shades of amber and gold. The silence between them deepened, but it wasn't hostile. It was heavy, filled with unspoken things. Finally, Melissa broke it. Her voice, soft and unsteady, carried only a few words. Words that held the weight of acknowledgement, not request. She said she was leaving town. That she wanted to see the house one last time. That she needed to understand what they had destroyed. Arthur didn't respond. He didn't forbid her, but he didn't grant permission either. He simply turned and stepped aside, leaving the doorway open behind him. Melissa climbed the steps slowly, her footsteps hesitant, like someone entering a church after years of absence. Inside, she moved carefully, her fingers brushing the edge of the doorway, the smooth surface of the walls, the frame of the mirror. Everything had changed, yet she recognized it, the echo of her past mistakes woven into every beam and corner. She stopped at the window overlooking the marsh, the same window where she had once stood laughing, wineglass in hand, believing the world would never catch her. Now, there was no laughter, no illusion, only silence and the soft hum of wind through the reeds outside. Arthur remained by the door, watching. He could see the shift in her, the way regret settled over her shoulders like a shroud. She turned to face him one last time. Her eyes were glassy but calm. There was no plea for redemption, only acceptance. Then, without another word, she left. Arthur watched as she crossed the yard, the wind catching her hair. She paused once at the gate, looked back at the house, and then was gone, the sound of the car fading down the road until there was nothing left but the steady hum of evening. He stood there for a long time after, holding Ethan's letter in his hand. Part of him had expected anger, perhaps even satisfaction, but what he felt instead was something simpler, finality. The story that began with betrayal had circled back to its origin, closing itself with quiet inevitability. He knew now that revenge had done its work. Justice had found its balance. What remained was forgiveness, not the kind that absolves, but the kind that frees. That night, Arthur sat at his desk and read the letter one last time. He thought about Ethan, somewhere out there, perhaps still struggling, perhaps already gone. He thought about Melissa, her quiet shame, her broken voice, her need to look one last time at the place that had once been her sin. And he thought about himself, a man who had built, lost, and rebuilt again. The letter, in the end, wasn't a message of guilt. It was a mirror, showing all three of them what they had become. Arthur placed it in the same drawer where he kept Margaret's old note, 2 letters, side by side, one from love, one from regret. And, for the first time, they felt like parts of the same story. As dawn broke the next morning, Arthur stepped onto the porch with his coffee. The world was still, the air crisp. The light spread across the marsh, washing everything in gold. The house stood behind him, strong and unyielding, its windows gleaming in the sunlight. It had seen love, betrayal, judgment, and mercy, and it had endured them all. He looked down the road where Melissa's car had vanished hours before and felt no anger, no pity, just peace. Because in the end, the past doesn't disappear. It simply stops demanding attention when you've learned everything it had to teach. Arthur turned back toward the house and smiled faintly. The Lakeview property was no longer a story of loss. It was a story of survival, for the house, for his daughter, and for himself. The air carried the scent of autumn again, that bittersweet mixture of earth and dry leaves that marked the quiet passage of another year. The Lakeview property stood beneath a soft sky, its white paint glowing faintly in the afternoon light. The marsh shimmered beyond, calm and reflective, as if the world itself was pausing to rest. Arthur Bennett had grown older in those months, but not weaker. His face had taken on the calm of a man who had survived everything that once sought to break him. The lines on his forehead were no longer marks of worry, but of wisdom. The house was finished. Every board, every nail, every brushstroke bore the quiet patience of his hands. It was whole again, inside and out. But Arthur knew something deeper. Restoration was never complete until it was shared. A house, like a life, was meant to hold purpose. He began to write again. At first, it was just notes, observations about the property, fragments of thought he jotted down in the evenings. But soon, the pages grew into stories. He wrote about the building of the house, the years with Margaret, the laughter of their daughter running through the halls. He wrote about loss, about betrayal, and about the rebuilding that came after. He didn't name names. He didn't record scandal. He recorded endurance, the way time bends but never breaks what's built with integrity. The act of writing became a kind of prayer. It steadied his hands, quieted his mind. Each word was a beam in a new foundation, a structure not made of wood, but of reflection. The story of the Lakeview house was no longer about pain, it was about continuity. In time, he shared parts of it with Anna, She read quietly, her expression soft and solemn as she turned each page. By the time she finished, her eyes carried both sorrow and pride. She understood now that the house was more than property. It was inheritance, not of wealth, but of strength. It was what her father had built, lost, and rebuilt again, each time stronger. That winter, she began visiting more often. Together, they added new life to the home. Bookshelves in the living room, framed photographs on the walls, small lamps that cast a golden glow in the evenings. The house no longer felt like a monument to suffering. It felt lived in again, warm, human. Word began to spread in the small town. People had always whispered about the Lakeview house, first about its fall, then about its silence. But now they spoke with admiration. They saw how Arthur had restored it, not through contractors or wealth, but through patience. Some asked him to advise them on their own renovations. Others stopped by just to see the garden. Arthur didn't mind. He welcomed them, but he never spoke of the past. The Lakeview property had become something else entirely, a quiet symbol of perseverance, a reminder that what's broken can still be made beautiful again. It was no longer defined by what happened there, but by what rose from it. As the months passed, Arthur had an idea, one that came to him one evening while sitting on the porch watching the sun fade over the water. He decided to open the house to others. Not as tenants, not as guests, but as a refuge. He reached out to a local community group that helped people recover from loss, widows, single parents, displaced families, those who needed a place to rest, reflect, or start over. The Lakeview house became part of that effort. A few rooms were set aside, furnished simply, kept open for those who needed them temporarily. There was no rent, no conditions. Just a key, a quiet place, and trust. Arthur didn't do it for charity. He did it because he understood what it meant to lose something and how sacred it was to be given a chance to rebuild. He called it the Bennett house, but to him, it would always be Lakeview. Each person who stayed left something behind, a note, a photo, a small token. Arthur kept them in a box in the study. Some thanked him. Some said nothing at all. But their presence gave the place new life. The laughter of children returned to the porch. The scent of home-cooked meals filled the kitchen. The echoes of joy, quiet, real, and unforced, once again filled the air. For the first time in years, the house wasn't haunted by memory. It was alive with renewal. Arthur spent his mornings walking along the marsh road, his hands in his pockets, the breeze tugging gently at his coat. He greeted neighbors again. He smiled more often. The bitterness that had once lived in his heart had faded into something softer, reflection, not resentment. He had punished betrayal with justice, but now he had outgrown even that. The house that once mirrored his pain now reflected his peace. He had reclaimed everything that mattered, not by taking, but by rebuilding. One evening, he sat by the window of the study, the same spot where he had once reviewed camera footage, waiting for evidence of betrayal. Now, the only light came from the soft glow of a lamp and the quiet rustle of papers as he wrote. He wrote about time, how it moves like a tide, erasing and revealing in equal measure. He wrote about the house, its walls, its rooms, its soul. He wrote about forgiveness, not the easy kind, but the kind that asks nothing in return. When he finished, he closed the notebook and set it aside. The title on the first page read, "The Legacy of Lakeview." The seasons shifted again. Winter came, cold but gentle. Snow fell softly across the marsh, coating the world in white silence. The Lakeview house stood firm beneath it, the warm light glowing through its windows. Inside, the fire crackled softly, and Arthur sat in his chair, wrapped in a blanket, watching the flames dance. Anna visited often now. She brought food, stories, laughter. Sometimes she came with friends, sometimes alone. And though she never said it outright, Arthur could see in her eyes that she had found peace too. Ethan was no longer part of their story. He had become a shadow, a memory fading in the distance. What remained was legacy. A house once broken, now whole. A father once burdened, now free. A family once fractured, now complete again, not by perfection, but by truth. On the first morning of the new year, Arthur stepped outside as the sun rose. The marsh glowed gold in the pale light, the air crisp and alive. He walked down the porch steps, the old wood creaking gently beneath his weight, and stood in the middle of the garden. The lily had withered for the season, but their roots were still alive beneath the soil, waiting. He knelt, brushed the frost from one of the flower beds, and smiled. Margaret would have loved this, he thought, the quiet triumph of it. The way the house had survived the seasons, the storms, the sins, and still stood unbroken. He whispered a small prayer under his breath, not of grief but gratitude. That afternoon, as the sky turned soft and blue, Arthur placed a small wooden sign near the front gate. It read, "The Bennett House, for those beginning again." He stepped back, looked at it, and nodded once. The story that began with betrayal had ended in restoration. The property that once symbolized pain now carried hope. And Arthur Bennett, the man who had been wronged and redeemed, finally understood what legacy truly meant. Not what you leave behind, but what you leave alive. The wind swept gently through the reeds, carrying the scent of earth and memory. The house stood quietly beneath the fading light, proud and still, its walls whispering the story of everything it had witnessed and everything it had become. The year turned slowly like a page in an old book. Winter faded, spring returned, and the air once again carried the scent of renewal. The Lakeview property, Arthur Bennett's second home, his battleground, his redemption, stood quietly at the edge of the marsh, breathing with the rhythm of the seasons. The house was no longer haunted, it had outlived its ghosts. Its windows gleamed in the morning sun, its garden bloomed again with lily and lavender, and its porch creaked softly under the weight of new footsteps, the kind that carried peace, not secrets. Arthur had grown older, but not weary. His hair had turned completely silver, his walk had slowed, but his mind remained sharp, as clear as the day he first stepped into this place decades ago with his late wife. He spent his mornings writing now. Not for publication, not for anyone's praise, but for clarity. Each page he filled was a reflection, a way to make sense of the long road behind him. It was on one of those mornings, sitting by the window overlooking the marsh, that he began his final letter. The letter was addressed simply, "To whoever finds this." He didn't know who it would be, perhaps Anna, perhaps a future visitor, perhaps no one at all. But he wrote it anyway, as though the house itself needed to hear his final words. The ink flowed steady, his handwriting slow but firm. He wrote of beginnings, of how this house had once been a dream, a retreat built on love and faith. He wrote of Margaret, her laughter echoing through the rooms, her hands planting the first rosebushes by the porch. He wrote of the years of quiet happiness, when the house had been full of light. Then, his words darkened. He wrote of loss, the day Margaret's laughter stopped, the silence that filled every corner after her passing. He wrote of how he left the house empty for years, unable to face the memories that lingered within its walls. And then, he wrote of the day he returned, the day he found his second home no longer his own. He described the scent of perfume, the unmade bed, the silver watch, the quiet discovery that shattered everything. He didn't write the names. They no longer mattered. The betrayal itself had long turned to dust. But he wrote of what it taught him, that even in deceit, there are truths worth finding. That people reveal themselves not when they love you, but when they think you'll never find out. And that sometimes, the only justice worth seeking is the kind that doesn't destroy you in the process. He paused to sip his coffee, watching the morning light shimmer across the marsh. The world was quiet, the kind of quiet that holds peace instead of loneliness. Then he continued. He wrote of restoration, of paint, wood, soil, and time. Of how he rebuilt the Lakeview house piece by piece, not to erase the past, but to understand it. He wrote of Anna, her heartbreak, her strength, the way she had returned to herself. He wrote of forgiveness, how it doesn't mean forgetting, but remembering without bitterness. And he wrote of the moment he realized that the Lakeview house was never truly his alone. It belonged to time, to memory, to everyone who had lived, loved, betrayed, and rebuilt within it. The house, he said, was like a mirror, showing each soul what they brought inside. Some brought deceit and found ruin. Some brought grief and found healing. And he, who once brought rage, found peace. His handwriting slow now, each word carrying weight. He wrote about justice. Not the kind found in courts or papers, but the quiet kind, the justice that arrives when the truth outlives the lie.